I was on that sub. I saw what they're pumping into the Baltic, and if they want me dead for saying it, they'll have to come get me on national television. The red tally light on the studio camera felt like a sniper's reticle centered on my forehead, but I didn't blink. I'd spent the last 48 hours running through the rain-slicked streets of Hamburg with a kill order over my head and the weight of a dying ocean in my pocket. The CEO was sitting in his glass tower, probably watching this in high definition, thinking his money could buy the horizon. But he'd underestimated one thing. A trucker doesn't just deliver the load, he makes sure the paperwork matches the reality. I had the logs, the coordinates, and the visceral memory of that toxic sludge clouding the deep blue. And now, the whole world was looking through my eyes. Natural transitions are the bridges we build between the hard miles and the truth we carry. You're watching Highway Stories Untold. When the world turns a blind eye to the truth, strong souls like you step up. Drop your experiences in the comments and inspire the fight. The salt air at Shannon Airport had been a brief mercy, a sharp, clean shock to my lungs after the recirculated silken secrets of that billionaire's Gulf Stream. I'd handed the black box to the Irish Gardaí, watched the blue lights flicker against the damp tarmac, and thought I was finally clear of the shadows and silk life. I told myself I was done. I wanted the smell of diesel, the hum of a real engine, and the straight-line honesty of a Florida interstate heading toward my daughter, Sarah. But the world has a way of pulling you back into the deep water, just when you think you've found the shallows. I hadn't even made it to a civilian gate before the phone in my pocket buzzed with a restricted number. It was a voice from my past, a man named Hauer I'd served with during a joint NATO exercise years ago, a man who didn't call unless the sky was falling. He didn't offer a greeting. He just said, "Jack, there's a specialized manifest in Kiel, Germany, 40 tons of deep-sea research gear. They need a driver who can handle high-value logistics and keep his mouth shut about the destination. The pay is enough to put Sarah through 10 years of college, but the client is Klaus von Geisler." The name hit like a cold front. Von Geisler was the kind of CEO who graced the covers of tech magazines, branded as the savior of the Baltic Sea, a man obsessed with deep-sea restoration. I should have walked away. I should have boarded my flight to Orlando. But Hauer sounded scared, and I've never been good at ignoring the tremor in a brave man's voice. 2 days later, I was pulling a custom-built reinforced trailer onto a private pier in Kiel, the grey waters of the Baltic churning under a heavy mist. The scientific equipment was housed in massive lead-lined pressurized canisters. They were heavy, far heavier than standard sonar or mapping gear. As I secured the chains, my trucker's instinct, that sixth sense honed over 1,000,000 miles, started screaming. The weight distribution was off. It felt like liquid shifting inside, a sluggish, heavy surge every time the trailer rocked. A man in a tailored tactical jacket approached me, his eyes hidden behind polarized lenses. He didn't look like a scientist. He looked like a fixer. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his English perfect and clinical. "You've been vetted. You deliver this to the support ship, the Aegir, 30 miles offshore. You will stay for the duration of the submersible launch to oversee the equipment integration. You are being paid for your expertise and your silence." "I'm a driver," I replied, my voice low and steady. "I deliver the load. I don't care what's in the boxes as long as the manifest is legal." He smiled, a thin, bloodless line. In this world, legality is a matter of perspective. The transport ship was a behemoth of steel and high-tech crane systems. Once my rig was winched aboard, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't the camaraderie of a crew. It was the tension of a tomb. There were men with submachine guns patrolling the gantry, their patches scrubbed. Von Geisler himself arrived by chopper, a silver-haired man with the tanned skin of someone who spent his life on yachts, while others bled in the sun. He looked at me like I was a piece of the machinery, necessary but disposable. The trouble started during the emergency surface meeting. One of the deep-sea drones had malfunctioned, and the research sub, a titanium-hulled bubble called the Abyss 1, had to surface early. I was on the gantry when the hatch hissed open. I saw the technicians rushing forward, but I also saw something they didn't expect me to notice. A valve on one of my canisters had been jolted loose during the ascent. A thick, iridescent sludge, black as used oil but with a sickly purple sheen, was weeping from the seal. I moved instinctively. Not to interfere, but to fix. That's what a driver does. He secures the load. But as I reached for the manual override, the smell hit me. It wasn't oil. It was a chemical rot so pungent it burned the back of my throat, smelling of ammonia and heavy metals. I looked at the scientific submersible. It wasn't rigged for cameras or sensors. Its underside was dominated by a high-pressure pumping manifold, the same kind used in industrial waste disposal. "What is this?" I muttered, the realization settling in my gut like lead. "Step away from the equipment, Mercer," a voice barked. I turned to see von Geisler standing at the top of the gangway. He wasn't smiling anymore. Behind him, 3 of his private security team were reaching for their sidearms. I was 30 miles out at sea, surrounded by men on his payroll, standing over a smoking gun that smelled like the death of an ecosystem. I realized then that I wasn't there to oversee integration. I was there because they needed a high-level fall guy with a military record to sign off on the transport logs if the authorities ever raided the ship. "This isn't research gear, Klaus," I said, my hand still near the leaking valve. "You're dumping. You're using a scientific expedition as a front to pump industrial poison into the deep-sea trenches where no one can see the bodies." Von Geisler walked down the stairs, his leather loafers clicking on the metal. "You're a trucker, Jack. You understand logistics. It costs $3 billion to properly neutralize this byproduct from my pharmaceutical plants. Or I can pay you $100,000 to drive it to a ship that disappears it into the dark. It's just business. The ocean is vast. It can swallow a lot of secrets." "Not this one," I said. I saw his hand move, a subtle signal to the men behind him. I didn't wait. I've spent my life navigating narrow lanes with 40 tons behind me. I know how to use momentum. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the integration kit and smashed the emergency fire alarm housing next to me. The ship erupted in a deafening strobe of red light and sirens. In the confusion of the crew scrambling, I lunged past the first guard, shoulder-checking him into the railing, and dived into the shadows of the lower deck. I knew the layout of the ship from the loading schematics I'd studied. I wasn't just running, I was hunting for proof. I made it to the communications hub, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed those coordinates. I needed the digital logs of the pressure pumps. If I could get those, von Geisler's business was over. But as I pulled my ruggedized phone to scan the terminal, a shadow fell over the doorway. It was the fixer from the pier. He held a silenced pistol, his expression bored. "You should have taken the money, Jack. Florida is beautiful this time of year. Now, you're just going to be another piece of deep-sea debris." The fixer didn't wait for a conversation. He squeezed the trigger, the muffled thwack of the suppressed round sparking off the steel bulkhead inches from my ear. I didn't have a weapon, but I had 40 years of leverage and a heavy industrial wrench still gripped in my right hand. I dove low, rolling under the bank of server monitors as a second shot shattered a glass screen above me. He was moving with the clinical precision of a professional, but he underestimated a trucker's ability to use a cramped space to his advantage. As he rounded the terminal, I swung the wrench with everything I had, catching him hard in the shin, the bone crack echoing in the small room. He grunted, his knee buckling, and I didn't give him the chance to reset his aim. I surged upward, slamming my shoulder into his chest and driving him back against the wall. I grabbed his wrist, twisting the suppressed pistol away and driving my elbow into his jaw. He was well trained, but he was fighting for a paycheck. I was fighting for the truth and a way back to my daughter. I disarmed him, kicked the gun under the heavy server rack, and used a plastic zip tie from the maintenance bench to secure his hands to the cooling pipe. "Where are the discharge logs?" I growled, my face inches from his. He spat blood at my boots, a cold smirk on his face. "Doesn't matter, Mercer. The kill order is already live. You think von Geisler only has guys on this ship? A hit team is intercepting the tender at the coast. You're already a ghost. I didn't waste time arguing. I turned to the main terminal, my fingers flying over the keys. I found the encrypted folder labeled Project Neptune. The sick irony of naming a poisoning operation after a sea god wasn't lost on me. I plugged in my encrypted drive, watching the transfer bar crawl forward. These were the hard receipts. GPS timestamps of the dumping sites, chemical compositions of the waste, and the wire transfer records to shell companies in Panama. It was enough to bury von Geisler for 1,000 years. The door hissed open again, and I saw the red glare of the emergency lights reflected in the polished floor. It wasn't the fixer. It was von Geisler himself, flanked by 2 more guards with submachine guns. He looked at the tied-up fixer, then at the drive plugged into the terminal. The mask of the visionary billionaire had completely slipped, replaced by the jagged, desperate edge of a cornered animal. "You're a persistent old man, Jack," he said, his voice echoing in the metallic hub. "But you're playing a game you don't understand. That data will never leave this ship, and even if it does, who believes a grease-stained trucker over a man who builds schools and saves reefs?" "The truth doesn't care about your schools, Klaus," I said, my hand hovering over the delete key of his primary backup as a bluff. "I've spent my life looking at the road ahead. I know a wreck when I see one, and you're headed for a wall." "Kill him," von Geisler commanded, stepping back into the hall. The guards raised their weapons, but the ship groaned as it hit a heavy swells, the floor tilting violently. I used the shift in momentum to kick the heavy rolling chair into the first guard's legs, sending him sprawling. I dove behind the main console as a hail of lead tore into the expensive equipment. The server room was a maze of wires and metal racks. It was my world now, a dark, confined space where size and noise meant less than leverage and timing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, high-intensity flare I'd swiped from the emergency kit on the gantry. I struck it, the blinding white light flooding the room and searing the guards' night vision-adjusted eyes. While they were blinded, I moved through the shadows, coming up behind the second guard and using a sleeper hold to take him out of the fight before he could blink. The first guard was scrambling to his feet, but I was already on him, a heavy punch to the solar plexus, folding him like a cheap lawn chair. I grabbed the encrypted drive. It was 100% complete. I didn't take their guns. I didn't want to be an assassin. I was a witness. I sprinted for the lower bay, where the emergency RIB, rigid inflatable boat, was docked. I could hear boots pounding on the deck above me, the shouting of men who realized their prey was getting away. I reached the bay, the cold Baltic air hitting me like a physical blow as I prepped the launch. The CEO thought he had every exit covered, but he forgot that a trucker knows how to find a bypass when the main highway is blocked. I lowered the RIB into the churning black water, the engine roaring to life with a defiant growl. As I sped away from the massive ship, the silhouettes of the guards appeared on the railing, their muzzle flashes lighting up the night like angry fireflies. I was alone in a small boat in the middle of the Baltic Sea, carrying enough evidence to ignite a global firestorm, and a professional hit team was waiting for me at the shore. I looked at the drive in my hand. I thought about the toxic sludge I'd seen weeping from that valve, and I thought about Sarah. I wasn't going underground. I was going to find the loudest microphone on the planet. The RIB slammed against the black swells of the Baltic with a bone-jarring rhythm that reminded me of a blown suspension on a washboard road in Alaska. I killed the running lights, navigating by the faint, jagged silhouette of the German coastline and the gut instinct for direction that never leaves a man who's spent his life tracking the horizon. Behind me, the Aegir was a floating fortress of light, but I knew the real danger wasn't the ship I was leaving, it was the reception waiting for me at the shore. Von Geisler's fixer had promised a hit team, and men like that don't make idle threats when their billion-dollar empires are leaking poison into the sea. I pulled my jacket tight, the encrypted drive tucked against my ribs, feeling the cold weight of the truth. I bypassed the main docks at Kiel, choosing instead a derelict finger pier near an old fish processing plant 5 miles south. As the hull scraped against the rotted wood, I didn't see a welcoming committee, but the silence was too heavy, the kind of quiet that precedes a multi-car pileup on a fog-choked interstate. I secured the boat and moved into the shadows of the rusted warehouse, my boots crunching on salt-crusted gravel. I needed a phone that wasn't being tracked, and a way to reach the one person I knew who wouldn't be bought off by a corporate check, an investigative journalist named Elena, who'd helped me expose a pharmaceutical scam 2 years back. I hadn't moved 50 yards before the high-pitched whine of a precision engine cut through the mist. A black SUV with tinted glass lurched from behind a shipping container, its headlights snapping on like twin predatory eyes. I didn't wait for them to open a door. I dived behind a stack of weathered pallets just as the first crack of a high-caliber rifle splintered the wood inches from my head. This wasn't a conversation. It was a liquidation. There were 3 of them, moving in a tactical spread that told me they were former special ops, likely the same breed of security von Geisler kept on his payroll to ensure his scientific reputation remained spotless. I used the layout of the yard to my advantage, weaving through the maze of rusted machinery and shipping crates. I found a heavy iron pry bar leaning against a generator housing and gripped it, the cold steel familiar and grounding. The lead shooter rounded a corner, his weapon leveled, but he was looking for a man running away. He wasn't expecting a 40-ton mentality trucker to be coming right at him. I swung the bar low, catching his lead leg and sweeping him off the concrete, then followed up with a heavy-handed strike to his temple that sent him into the dark. I didn't stay to check his pulse. I grabbed his burner phone and kept moving. The rain started then, a cold, needle-like drizzle that slicked the asphalt and blurred the world into shades of charcoal. I knew they had thermal optics. Staying in the open was a death sentence. I ducked into a nearby industrial garage, the smell of grease and old coolant hitting me with a wave of nostalgia for the shops back home. I found a set of heavy-duty jumper cables and a car battery, rigging a quick and dirty distraction that would blow the lights if they stepped through the main breaker. When the second man entered, the garage erupted in a spray of blue sparks and darkness. In the confusion, I moved like a ghost through the machinery. I understood better than they ever would. By the time I reached the perimeter fence, the third man was closing the gap, his footfalls heavy and synchronized. I dived through a gap in the chain link, rolling into a shallow drainage ditch that smelled of brackish water and diesel. I was wet, freezing, and outnumbered, but I had the receipts, and the fire in my gut was hotter than the cold mud on my face. I managed to flag down a local delivery van a mile down the road. The driver, a weary-eyed kid who looked like he'd pulled a double shift. I showed him a €100 note and told him I needed to get to the NDR television studios in Hamburg. No questions asked. The drive to Hamburg was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked asphalt. I used the burner phone to relay a coded message to Elena. The deep sea gear is dumping. I have the logs and the coordinates. Meet me at the studio back entrance in 2 hours. Bring the live feed crew. I knew von Geisler would be tracking the van eventually, but he wouldn't expect me to walk straight into the brightest light in the city. As we pulled into the shadows of the media district, I saw the black SUV trailing us 2 blocks back. The timer was almost at 0. I slipped out of the van before it even came to a full stop, disappearing into the service alley of the broadcast center. Elena was there, her face tight with worry, but her eyes sharp with the scent of a career-defining story. "Jack, you look like hell," she whispered, pulling me toward the heavy soundproof doors. "The ocean looks worse," I replied, handing her the encrypted drive. "Get this on the monitors. I'm going on air. If they try to stop me, make sure the whole world sees who's doing the stopping." I could hear the lobby doors being forced open behind us, the shouting of security being bypassed by men who didn't care about the law. I walked onto the set of the International News Hour, the bright studio lights blinding for a second before I found the center mark. The studio floor was a different kind of battlefield, one of cameras and cables rather than wrenches and waves. I felt the eyes of the technicians on me. A man covered in mud, salt and grease standing in the middle of their sterile, glass and chrome world. I didn't care about the optics. I cared about the irreversible change I was about to trigger. The red light on the camera started blinking, a 3-second countdown to a truth that couldn't be unsaid. I thought about the thousands of miles of dead reef and the poison I'd seen with my own eyes. "Go live," I told the producer, my voice a low rumble that cut through the frantic whispering of the crew. Behind the glass, I saw Elena frantically uploading the files to the broadcast server, the progress bar, a ticking clock against the men now pounding on the soundstage doors. They were here, and they were desperate. I took a breath, the air smelling of ozone and studio makeup, and looked directly into the lens. The studio doors groaned under the weight of a heavy tactical ram, the sound echoing through the soundstage like a gunshot. I didn't flinch. I'd seen what was at the bottom of the Baltic, and after that, a few men in suits with badges they'd bought didn't carry much weight. The floor manager was pale, her headset slipping as she looked from the shaking doors to the red on-air light. She was waiting for me to run. But a trucker knows that once you've committed to a downhill grade with a full load, the only way out is through. "Keep the cameras rolling," I said, my voice cutting through the panic of the crew. "If you cut the feed now, you're just helping them bury the bodies." The red light turned solid. I looked straight into the lens, seeing not just a piece of glass, but the millions of people sitting in their living rooms, the people who drank the water and walked the beaches von Geisler was poisoning. I felt the grit of the shipyard on my skin and the cold damp of the drainage ditch in my clothes, a stark contrast to the polished chrome of the news desk. I was a long-haul driver from Florida, a man who usually kept his head down and his eyes on the white lines. But today, I was the only thing standing between a billionaire and the death of a sea. "I was on that sub," I began, the words steady and heavy. "I saw what they're pumping into the Baltic. For years, Klaus von Geisler has been telling you he's saving the ocean while he's been using it as a private graveyard for industrial waste." Behind the glass of the control booth, Elena gave me a sharp nod. On the monitors surrounding the set, the files from the encrypted drive began to scroll, the hard receipts. Digital maps flickered to life, showing red clusters of dumping coordinates that looked like a spreading infection across the seafloor. Then came the internal memos, the ones that calculated the acceptable loss of marine life against the $3 billion saved in disposal costs. It was the kind of proof that doesn't just suggest a crime, it demands a reckoning. The studio doors finally gave way with a splintering crash. 3 men in tactical gear burst onto the floor, their weapons drawn, the light from the studio rafters glinting off their visors. The camera crew scrambled, but the lead cameraman, a grizzled veteran who'd probably seen war zones before this, held his position, keeping the frame tight on my face. I didn't move. I stood my ground, my hands resting flat on the desk, a silent protector in a world of loud lies. "You're on international television," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room without me having to shout. "The whole world is watching you choose which side of history you want to be on. You can pull those triggers, but you can't kill the data. It's already gone viral." The lead hitman hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. He looked at the monitors, then at the red light of the camera, and finally at me. He realized what von Geisler hadn't. You can't intimidate a man who has nothing left to lose and the truth in his pocket. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the realization that his employer was no longer a benefactor, but a sinking ship. "Check the news feeds, fellas," I added, leaning forward just an inch. "The German federal police are already at von Geisler's headquarters. Your payroll just dried up." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a strategic situation that had shifted so far it could never be undone. One by one, the men lowered their weapons. They weren't heroes, but they weren't fools either. They retreated into the shadows of the wings just as the sirens of the actual authorities began to wail outside the building. I stayed on that mark, until the segment producer gave me the clear signal, my heart finally slowing its frantic pace. I walked off the set and found Elena. She was shaking, but she had a smile that could have lit up the Hamburg harbor. "We did it, Jack. The engagement numbers are through the roof. Every major agency is picking it up. Von Geisler is done. He was done the minute he thought he could use a truck driver to hide his rot," I said, rubbing the back of my neck where the tension had settled into a dull ache. I felt the weight of the last 48 hours crashing down on me. The flights, the chases, the sub, and the shadows. I wanted to be back in the cab of my rig, where the problems were simple and the road was straight. I left the studio through the back, dodging the growing crowd of reporters and onlookers. I didn't want the fame, I didn't want the interviews, I just wanted the salt of the Baltic to be the only thing left on my skin, and the knowledge that the water would stay blue for Sarah's generation. I found a quiet diner 3 blocks away, a place that smelled of coffee and fried potatoes, the universal language of the road. I sat in a corner booth, watched the rain wash the grime off the windows, and realized I finally had a clear path home. The hum of the diner's refrigerator was a grounded, honest sound, a low-frequency vibration that felt a lot more like home than the high-tech whir of a billionaire's submersible. I sat in the back corner booth, my hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise in the dim light. My fingernails were still stained with the iridescent residue of that toxic sludge, a reminder that some stains don't wash off with soap and water. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, blurred by the Hamburg rain, and barely recognized the man looking back. I wasn't just a trucker anymore. I was a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink when the abyss tried to buy my silence. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the gallery until I found a photo of Sarah. She was laughing, her hair wind-blown, standing on a pier in Florida with the Atlantic stretching out behind her like an infinite promise. That was the water I was fighting for. I thought about the thousands of miles I'd driven, the countless sunrises I'd watched through a bug-splattered windshield, and how I'd always believed that the road was a place of truth. You either make the grade or you don't. You either deliver the load or you fail. Von Geisler had tried to turn the world's most vast, sacred space into a shortcut for his bottom line, and in doing so, he'd forgotten that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how much lead you wrap around it. The television mounted above the counter flickered with a breaking news update. I didn't need to hear the volume to know what they were saying. I saw the footage of the Asia being boarded by authorities, the scientific equipment being seized as evidence, and a grainy shot of von Geisler being led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his head bowed. There was no joy in seeing it. Only a quiet, heavy sense of justice being restored to the scale. He had underestimated the old trucker, thinking my life was measured only in miles and freight, never realizing that those miles give a man a very long time to think about right and wrong. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, carved wooden lighthouse I'd bought for Sarah months ago. It felt solid and real. I'd spent too much time in the shadows and silk lately, dealing with men who spoke in riddles and hid behind encrypted files. I was ready for the diesel smoke, the smell of rain on hot pavement, and the simple dignity of a job where your word is your bond. I'd delivered the most important load of my life tonight, and for the first time in a long time, the manifest in my heart finally matched the cargo I was carrying. A waitress walked over, her eyes tired but kind, and refilled my mug without asking. She glanced at the TV, then back at me, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. I just gave her a small, tired nod and pulled my cap lower. I didn't need a salute or a thank you. I just needed to know that when Sarah waded into the surf next summer, the water would be as clean as the look in her eyes. I stood up, left a $20 bill on the table, more than the coffee was worth, but enough to maybe make her shift a little easier, and walked out into the cool night air. The rain had let up, leaving the city lights shimmering on the wet cobblestones like fallen stars. I walked toward the train station, my pace steady and unhurried. The kill order was gone, the secrets were out, and the quiet protector could go back to being just Jack. I had a flight to catch, a daughter to hug, and 1,000 more miles of highway waiting for me. As I boarded the train, I took one last look toward the harbor. The Baltic was out there, dark and deep, but tonight it was breathing a little easier, and so was I. The miles ahead don't seem so long when you know you're headed toward the people who make the journey worth it. You're watching Highway Stories Untold. If this story reminded you that some things are worth standing up for, no matter how much time has passed, hit that subscribe button and join the convoy. We're building a community here of people who believe in honor, the truth, and looking out for the person in the lane next to you. Drop a Baltic in the comments if you've ever had to face down a ghost of your own. And if you want, tell us about it. It's an honor to have you riding. I'll see you on the next haul. Stay safe out there.